if it doesn't come from the top and there's not meaningful, and my best word is intention, to overcome what we know to be historically an issue for our industry, then I think its potential for success is very limited.
Welcome to People Who Perform, the Real Estate Careers Podcast. Each episode will bring you conversations from business leaders and up-and-coming stars in the commercial real estate industry in Canada. Our guests will share their unique career journeys, passions, and advice on what it takes to be successful in this industry. This podcast is brought to you by Highview Partners, connecting people who perform in Canadian real estate.
My name is Nicola Denning-Millar, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Cheryl Gray. For those who may not know Cheryl, she brings over 43 years of experience in the real estate management industry, having served in executive roles with a number of major Canadian real estate firms, most recently as EVP at Quadrille Property Group. Cheryl was the president of the Institute of Real Estate Management in 2020 and has been a member of the Real Estate Institute of Canada's Board of Directors, where she won the prestigious Emeritus Award. She has served as the Secretary-Treasurer on the National Board of BOMA and received the Canada's Chairman Award, along with many other awards throughout her successful career. She currently has her own consulting firm and remains active in the industry, providing real estate expertise to clients, serves as an advisory board member, and is a member of the Institute of Real Estate Management Foundation Board of Directors. Good morning, Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
So we've got a lot to cover, so let's dive straight in.
Sounds great.
So there's many trends and insights that are shaping the commercial real estate industry right now, but the topic of diversity, equity, and inclusion seems to be an increasingly critical one. So let's start by talking about why DEI is so important in commercial real estate.
Well, I certainly think that there has been a historical perspective where many organizations and certainly real estate associations have viewed DE&I in its traditional sense as important. I think what has brought it to the forefront for not only the real estate management industry, but I think generally most of us can point back to in May of 2020 with George Floyd's death, that it came to the realization, I think for many of us, we needed to be doing more. We needed to be more intentional. And from that, there was really a groundswell that many started to implement more meaningful plans and actions around making sure that DE&I was incorporated within their business. Specifically for real estate management, when you think about what it is that we do in commercial real estate, where we're engaging with the public, whether it be in office buildings where they work or in retail where they shop, certainly where people live, and all of the other uses, it is really something that we touch the community in which we serve globally and locally. And if you're not representative of that community in terms of your own organization and initiatives, then I think that you're really not engaging the diversity of the community. But more importantly, what I would say to focus on internally is that, as we've seen historically, where they talk about, when there's greater gender diversity on a board and the positive outcomes that have come as a result of that for an organization, it really is just a groundswell that it's not just about gender. It is shown that when you think of it, there's an improvement to the bottom line. There's better engagement, certainly in these times, employee engagement, as well as I think the opportunity for you to really improve the diversity of thought and productivity and the things that you're doing within the company. So those attributes have really been at the forefront of, I think, many of the conversations. And certainly if you look at some of the recent surveys and statistics that are out there, are being borne out more and more as time goes by.
I think that the key word there is intention. I mean, intentional promotion of DEI. I think it's quite obvious that organizations can then better reflect and serve the diverse needs of the communities that they serve and operate in, especially if those decision makers are from diverse backgrounds themselves.
Correct.
In terms of some statistics, and we all know, that this is a real estate is a male dominated industry. I think from a sort of percentages point of view, I want to throw out some numbers that seem to be consistent across the board. In that, right now in commercial real estate, white men hold more than 50% of senior professional positions versus 20% of women, 11% of men of color, and 7.6% of women of color. So very obvious that diversity is lacking. And obviously that's not just, a gender and ethnicity thing. There are other marginalized populations as well, age, sexual orientation, religion, and so forth. So what are the challenges and barriers that exist in implementing DEI practices in our industry?
Well, I think the statistics that you've quoted certainly are accurate and, may differ depending on the study that you read. I think that what I would say is, in order for us to really have meaningful conversations, and this is what I said earlier about being intentional, is, when I thought about my own career and those that I worked with as I moved from one level of the organization to another or moved organizations, that the more senior my roles became, the more unusual it was to see someone of a different background. And I think one of the things that I'm always conscious of is it isn't just about gender or ethnicity. There are a lot of things that I think today, when we talk about diversity, that are more inclusive, not to be a pun, that we need to think about. So I think the historic trend has been a male white dominated industry where women have certainly made some strides. I think ethnicity still has a long way to go, but even from any of the most recent information that you can gather around the conversation is that women have not, or ethnicity has not moved itself to the more senior levels. So one of the things that I did want to bring into the conversation, because I've been very fascinated by what they've been doing as to how do we overcome that as an industry, is through an initiative that was started by the Australian government called Champions of Change. And in Australia, one of the dominant, or if not the dominant, real estate organization is the Property Council of Australia. And they introduced a program back in 2015 embodying what the government had done for all industries. And they have a program called the Male Champions of Change. And I would encourage anyone to go search for it, because the strides they have made in the 7 to 8 years that they have done this, today there's almost a couple of hundred organizations in the Property Council that are part of it, but they actually realize that passive policies or programs or initiatives were not really moving the needle. And the reason it's called Male Champions of Change is most of the C-suite were male, and they began a conscious effort to move their organizations by specifically making sure that there was training and programs and opportunity, unconscious bias, all of the things we're talking about in the North American context. They've been working on. And one of their most surprising initiatives that I think is incredibly important and something that I still feel is lacking here in our markets is around pay equity, and looking at those types of things. So If it doesn't come from the top, very long answer to say to wrap up, if it doesn't come from the top and there's not meaningful, and my best word is intention, to overcome what we know to be historically an issue for our industry, then I think its potential for success is very limited.
I love the idea of a group of men being powerful allies in the fight for DEI and actually using their power and influence to really promote these initiatives. And I also think, yes, it needs to come from the top. But again, the word is intentional. It needs to be intentional and to actively work to change systems, policies, and cultures that are not inclusive. There really does need to be more women and people of colour in C-suite positions, on boards, in decision-making positions. I feel sometimes that the momentum sort of slows sometimes, but I guess it's everyone's responsibility to keep pushing it forward and making meaningful, long-lasting changes. Have you heard of anything like this in Canada?
Well, I know that just prior to the pandemic, representatives from Australia attended a symposium that I went to in New York, and we actually had a meeting of a number of industry stakeholders. I know there have been conversations with some associations in Canada and similarly in the US, but it has not got traction. In fact, in preparing for a conversation today, I thought, I'm just going to double check because pandemic slowed some things down, but perhaps there's been new developments. And there's a small organization in London, Ontario, actually called Champions for Change. And it's really a group of young, diverse women who are advocating really for gender parity and a number of things in their mission, but nothing like this that the Property Council of Australia has put into place.
Do you think that there's a resistance to change in the sense of, do you think some people view DEI initiatives as maybe unnecessary or disruptive to established norms and practices?
No, I don't think so. I think two things are a challenge, particularly I think in the real estate industry. And the examples I would give you is that it's not so much as people not wanting to make it a priority, but when you think of where the needle gets moved in the industry, I two key examples that I would give you is for firms like those that I've worked for in my career, where we're large organizations, institutional, we have the bandwidth, we have the tools, the resources, the expertise to do a lot of the implementation of things that I would consider to be leading the industry in a new direction or building on improving what we have been doing, whatever that practice or policy is. Smaller firms are challenged. And so it does become a budget issue, it does become a resource issue. It's interesting if you read PwC and ULI do a study every year on emerging trends in real estate. And if you look at where DE&I has landed on the priority, given all of the other disruptions that are going on in the industry right now, from labor to construction costs to interest rates, it has moved down. I think in both the U.S. and Canada, one was I think positioned 12 out of 13 priorities. So it is not unlike other things that can be seen as a nice to have that might be buffeted by financial challenges. I also think it is incumbent upon those that have leadership roles, and I'm encouraged to see in the Canadian space, our largest firms are doing a lot around DE&I, and I think that will move the needle for the industry because they have the resources and the ability to do so.
And they often have dedicated staff and departments, DEI officers within. But you're right, I think, smaller companies would be challenged in that way. I read actually recently that only a third of firms report having a dedicated budget for DEI. Or maybe they have DEI programs, but they don't necessarily have a formal policy. And maybe, like you say, that's because there are just so many competing demands.
Yeah, I think in response to that, what I would say is that in many cases, in talking to people in the industry here in the Canadian space, and again, just being a past president of the Institute of Real Estate Management, I'm very connected with what they are doing as an organization, as an association, that there's definitely a desire and a commitment to doing it. But at the same time, there are competing priorities, and it typically seems to be landing more in the human resources department, whether it's budget or resources. But the larger the firm, the more potential for success. It's less and less as you start getting down to the mid-size or smaller firms. Statistically, there just isn't the bandwidth and financial ability to do much at this point. The one
Mm.
thing I do want to comment on, because I think it's important for your listeners to understand, is if you look at any of the major real estate associations that influence our industry, in which most of our participants join for the most part. And I'm focusing probably more on real estate management, but the Institute of Real Estate Management, started this program around DE&I, made the commitment to hire, now do a certificate program. BOMA Canada, has resources and information that they published, and I know many of the locals are doing initiatives. Toronto, one of the biggest in Canada for BOMA, is doing that. BOMA International is very committed. That and they started their journey again in 2020. If you look at the National Apartment Association, and also what's interesting, if you look at many of the industry foundations, IREM has one. I know IFMA does. That when you look at what they're doing, they're doing a lot to promote bringing in that next generation into the industry, and also its diversity. And the problem that I think we're seeing, and certainly I was reading, is that we're getting much, much better at the grassroots. But in order to, elevate people, I think over time you will see that diversity improve from a statistic standpoint much more as you get into mid-level, more senior, and ultimately C-suite and boards. But it will take some time to move the industry in that direction.
And I do fully acknowledge, from having previous podcast guests from, BOMA and Toronto Crew, that those and other associations, they have formed a sort of collective for pushing these initiatives. I guess it's just, we just want things to happen faster. So I have a 3-part question for you now. So since you joined the industry 40 years ago, what positive changes have you seen? Where are the biggest areas for development? And what do you think are the priorities?
Joining the industry in 1980, I was in Calgary, and at that time, it was booming. So my role was very highly involved in new buildings, so under construction, and working in the property management team and taking them over. So it was unusual because I worked for the general manager, who was a woman, and I was her sort of right hand. And it was not a commonplace thing to see general manager or property manager. Women were still few and far between. And that really carried through as I moved to Toronto in 1984. Again, my career was very involved around new buildings and transitioning to operating properties, and highly involved with the construction and development side. And I always remember the one story that I took over in 1987, an office property that had 3 existing buildings and 1 under construction. And I took over from a male property manager and was put into the role and attended the first construction meeting and was assumed to be the secretary, not the manager that I was. So, you definitely had to stake your territory. I think someone said to me, sort of elbows out at that time. Fast forward to today, it's really common to see women in our industry at what I would call even to the sort of mid and upper mid management levels. Although I will say there's still lots of opportunities to talk about, um, you know, struggling in still some facets of the industry in real estate that we deal with, construction being one of them, engineering, great to see more women, but you're still dealing in a very male dominated space, building operations staff. Where we have made great strides is, I think, an awareness about it. I don't recall us ever having conversations back in the 80s and perhaps even in the 90s about it the way that we are today. I think that there's greater parity around wages. I still think we have a long way to go when it comes to the executive and C-suite levels. And I'm not so sure that there's as much transparency around pay equity that we should have. And that's really a gender-based answer. When it comes to the other elements of what we talk about being DE&I today, where it's ethnicity, religious, LGBTQ, those I think have a greater awareness, but still have a further journey than what we talk about when it's gender only.
I think in terms of awareness, which you've mentioned, I mean, certainly now there's an awareness of sexual harassment and discrimination that's led to stronger policies and procedures, which obviously address those issues and hopefully create a safer work environment, and also improvements in workplace policies. I'm going to assume that sort of back in the day, there wasn't as many flexible work arrangements, parental leave, sick days for family members, better all-encompassing benefits for families. Would you say that those kind of policies have improved as well?
Well, I think the policies have improved, and I think I would probably do a divide between pre-pandemic, post-pandemic. But certainly pre-pandemic, there's no question. I mean, regulations, maternity leave, paternity leave, harassment in the workplace, all of those things have come to the fore. I don't know that post-pandemic there's been as much around the regulatory side because I think they're just those things are accepted norms. What is interesting though is the conversations around lifestyle choices and the flexibility. Do I need to be in the office and make that commute? And I think the industry is still being disrupted by that. But it does show that being more accommodating to an individual or a group of individuals work-life balance is definitely coming to the forefront. And I think that does play to, thinking about equity and inclusion and recognizing that there is diversity in need that has nothing to do with gender or ethnicity. So your point to me is that I think we're thinking more broadly in terms of the workplace itself and the people that interact in that workplace. So it's important for everyone to consider. It's not necessarily what the company wanted. I mean, there was a time, as I said to my 31-year-old daughter, when you went to go get a job, you looked like, this is my title, this is my pay, this is kind of the responsibilities. People are more conscious now of the kinds of organizations that they want to work for and the values that that organization has and how they're going to complement that individual's preferences and desires to be part of that organization.
Agreed. And we'll come to a little bit more of that later on. So, in essence, I mean, what we're saying is that there's still a long way to go, but the progress made so far provides reason for optimism.
Yes, I think the benefits of being around as long as I've been around and is that there's constant disruption in the real estate management industry. And for me, when I think back Y2K was our doomsday scenario that many of us had to deal with coming up to the year 2000. The evolution of what we now say ESG, but green, the greening of real estate was a huge debate in the early 2000s. And what did that mean? And my thought process at the time was, you will not be calling it a green building at some point. It will just be a building. At some point, we're not going to call it a smart building as with the prop tech disruption. It will just be a building because that's the way they're being built. And in addition to that, I think the conversation around DE&I at some point will mature. It won't end, as ESG hasn't ended, as smart building certainly hasn't ended, but it will be a much more sophisticated, accepted norm, for lack of a better word, than I think we're seeing today. So yes, huge optimism, but that's what the industry does and always will do in terms of evolving and becoming more encompassing of modern technologies, best practices. I'm very optimistic that the industry will get this better over time, and at some point it's not even really that much of a conversation because we will all accept that's just the way it is.
And I love your example of a green building just being called a building. And hopefully one day that'll translate to, it won't matter whether you're black, white, female, male, gay, what culture you're from, you'll just be a human being.
Exactly.
Are you able to share some examples with us of obstacles that you've experienced in your career as a woman and what you did to overcome them?
There's a number of things that I would say have been particularly memorable in my experience, but one of the things that I was always focused on was what I wanted and going after those opportunities. And for the younger folks that I've mentored over the years, waiting for someone to come along and believe in you or shape your future, it's really in your hands, and you have to be tenacious enough and you have to be confident enough to be able to advocate for yourself. I think as a woman, that was even more so important for me to consider because I was very rarely shoulder tapped for promotions in the earlier days of my career. And it was only because I went after them, in some cases more than once, that I was able to secure the position. And I think I proved myself each time because the results were there, and I felt successful in them. But I would have to say that even as I moved past into vice president and senior vice president, there was a point in time with I was the only female who didn't have a senior or executive in front of my title, and I was told, well, my department was a bit small, or even though I had built it substantially from what it was. So I think you need to advocate for yourself and get that recognition. I think it comes more easily for people who are like mind. And I say that meaning, if you're male and you're white, then it seemed to be that the trust was there of the ability, whereas I always felt I had to prove myself.
Mm.
The other example that I would give that I think was not funny at the time, but I look back, is I actually worked for someone for several years who I felt, as a number of others did, was perhaps not the right person for the role, ended up being terminated, and I applied for the position. And about 2 months into the job, same scope, same responsibilities, same number of staff, I happened to open my desk drawer quite quickly. And of course, it was this person's previous office. And a pay stub floated out. And I picked it up. And that person was making substantially more. That male ahead of me had been making substantially more than what I was being paid for that position. And I had to go and advocate. I never did get quite what they were getting, but there was at least an acknowledgement that something needed to be done. But again, it goes back to that fundamental rule that I always followed is I couldn't and wouldn't wait for someone to advocate for me. If it came, that was a real bonus. But I did most of that on my own, and I helped others who needed that encouragement along the way because it's not always easy and it doesn't always come intuitively to folks.
I think that's really good advice, actually, because we often say the same to people that we're working with, that it's really important to try and, get yourself out of your comfort zone and volunteer to do jobs outside of your job description. So you're sort of expanding your duties and gaining as much knowledge and experience as you can. And you're almost doing the job above you before you actually get the promotion.
Yes, I read an article once. I always found it interesting. Never pursued, the foundation for it. It was in an HR related article, but men are hired for their potential was what it said. Women are hired if they have proven themselves. And I think that it's an interesting conversation, and certainly one coming from the real estate management side, which is not the money making side of real estate, which always puts us at a bit of a disadvantage because we're a big expense side, and the value that gets placed on it already puts you at a disadvantage, let alone any other challenges that might come your way.
It's really interesting that you've brought that up because that supports what we find when we're hiring, that men will look at a job description and look at the 80% of the job that they can do, ignoring the 20% that they can't. Whereas women will look at a job description and focus in on the things that they do not have experience in, rather than all the things that they can do. So that's a really, really interesting point, Cheryl.
Absolutely, I agree.
Can you now share some examples of successful DEI initiatives that you've seen that work in real estate?
Well, the one thing that I would share is actually a very personal experience. So the year that I mentioned I was president of the Institute of Real Estate Management, I spoke with our CEO, and we looked at what we were doing in the organization. We looked at the staffing of the organization. We looked at the demographics of our membership, and we both felt that we could be doing more. And we brought in a consultant who specialized in DE&I. And through that journey, the interesting aspects of, you think, as I recall saying, I don't care what the person is, it can be pink with purple polka dots. I just want the best person for the job. And, she helped many of us in leadership at IREM learn about unconscious bias. We actually even did an exercise with our executive committee where we all sat around a room. There's 20 some of us in the room with some staff, and started out with very simple questions. What's your favorite color? What's your favorite food? What's your most difficult memory of your childhood? And we were fortunate that we had a very diverse group, age-wise, ethnicity, etc. And the personal stories that you learned, with what my experience was growing up in Saskatchewan, and the biases that you could learn around Indigenous. One of our executive committee members who was Black, and some of his experiences that he had had as a young man and interaction that we know those of us that were white would not have experienced. And that gave us all an eye opener into how meaningful understanding everyone's perspective is. And what we learned that day was it's not put in place, hire someone who's in charge of DE&I, and that's going to solve it. So I think what I've been seeing within organizations like, commercial real estate firms, but also our associations, everyone's realizing that it's not just about a policy or hiring practices or, creating a budget and some committees. it's about education, it's about awareness, it's about intention, and being actively engaged in nurturing all of the things that we are now coming to realize are important if we're ever going to really consider ourselves, somewhat successful or hopefully completely successful as we move through this journey. So personally for me was a very complex um, opportunity for us to realize, and this is the one thing I'll say that was my aha moment in speaking with her. We had a diversity advisory board at IREM, and her question to me is, why are they all Black women? And we realized, that's not diversity either. And that was because everyone's perception was that was who applied, so that's who should go on. And there's now a much bigger effort for us to say, it's representation for everyone. And that was a real moment for us as we shared those stories with our members and our chapters that started doing initiatives. And I'm very proud to see that, Roma Toronto is doing these things. I'm proud to see that, some of my past employers and some of our largest firms are really embracing these meaningful conversations and discussions and are not just saying, I have a policy or I have a DE&I, chief of DE&I or something like that. So I it's very encouraging to me to see how far this has moved in what I consider to be a relatively short period of time, to build on what things were there, but I don't think we were as mindful of what they should have been until recently.
The key to success is obviously continually evaluating and improving those initiatives as well. Just to make sure that they're having a meaningful impact and a positive impact. How do real estate companies measure the impact and success of their efforts, Cheryl?
Well, I think data is obviously necessary. I mean, the old adage, you can't manage what you can't measure. The challenge in saying that in its most simplest way doesn't really address what I talked about, the complexity of the problem. So, HR systems generally, or it may not be a system, could be people, can track information around your employees, your demographics. And I think that's probably one of the most low hanging fruit you can think of. I think employee engagement and the ability to move people through the organization is as equally important. And I think the other thing to consider, and I am a huge advocate, is these firms that are making these investments and are managing and measuring and being intentional need to help those in the industry that don't have those resources. So it becomes more of a norm within the industry versus the firms that can afford it. And the success, when you think about the diversity of the real estate in Canada and, how a lot of the higher end is concentrated in certainly institutional ownership and REITs to some extent. There are a ton of smaller organizations in all asset classes that don't have the ability to focus on how to develop programs and how to measure success and how to create standards. And that's where the bigger organizations, I think, can take their learnings and take their processes and engagement policies, et cetera, and start sharing them more broadly through the real estate associations is one way. And I think that work is happening in Canada. And I certainly know through a couple of the larger organizations in the US that that's true as well. So, it's not just about the data. Size does matter, but because you can put in and implement, I think you also have to include people along the way. You need to train, you need to create awareness and continue to further the conversations at all levels of the organization in order to end up with data that has any meaning.
And track it over time as well.
Absolutely, yes.
What advice would you give to people from within a minority group who are entertaining a career in commercial real estate, but they're maybe concerned about underrepresentation or the industry being too exclusive or non-inclusive?
I think the good news to answering that question is it's far easier today for entrants to see people like them or other underrepresented groups participating. And, from all the stats that I've read and certainly my own experience in working, it's pretty common today to see a far more diverse audience when you're speaking to employees as a group, et cetera. I think the conversations are the same at an entrance level. They've become a little more customized if you're talking to someone at a senior level. I'm saying maybe director or general manager or something like that. Because I think in those conversations, I go back to what I said before. People are very intentional, I think, today about the organizations they choose to work for. So you need to make sure that when you're talking to them about those opportunities, that you either, if you're in an organization representing it, that you share the values of the organization, the efforts that you're making in these and other areas. And if you're not within an organization, you're in a mentoring role or something, is what questions should you ask? And, to look around and see how you feel you may fit into that organization, or even better, could become an advocate within that organization if you feel that their values and their mission are complementary to your life goals and aspirations. So more important in my mind with it is that people coming into the industry, generally, I don't think we're getting to the right levels. It's more common in the US for people to be in university programs that are actually in real estate and even in real estate management. There's very little of similar ilk available here in Canada. And I know there's been a huge focus. I think IREM, for example, has relationships with 27 different universities and certainly HBCUs in the US. We don't have that kind of educational structure or programs here to the same degree, especially real estate management, very specifically. But I think people have made choices. And in my view, and many that I attended a meeting of quite a number of associations just prior to the pandemic. And we talked about getting to the high schools and showing people the opportunities. And that can be anything from building operations to the property management side, leasing, et cetera, where I don't think people really know or understand what property management does. As I tried to explain my own career, and my kids even asked, oh, so you worry if the building's clean. And it's a really challenging conversation to explain what it is that we really do as property managers. And I think the importance of the role we play. And I always feel that those are exciting conversations to be able to have with entrants to the industry, along with conversations around DE&I and climate change and the impact that we really can make a difference in what I consider to be global issues that people sometimes don't think about.
So really it comes down to educating young people in high school and university, allowing them to recognize the industry as a successful career, communicating with them better to showcase what they could do and where they can take their careers, because it is so diverse and there really is likely something for everyone's appetite.
Yeah, one of the initiatives that I've often referred folks to is there's 25 associations, mostly U.S. based, but as applicable really across North America, and it's career building communities. So it's careerbuildingcommunities.org. It's 25 associations who represent all facets of real estate. And you actually can do a little quiz, which is kind of cool, to give you some feedback on where you might fit. And it's from urban planning, it's architecture, it's land development, it's property management, it's leasing, it's sales. So it's every micro component of what you might consider real estate as a career that you can go in and learn about. And this was put in place, I guess, around 2018, if I recall. But it is something that gives people insight into when you say, "Oh, what's your career?" and you say real estate, just all the different things that can mean. And most young people don't have that awareness. So it was a great communication tool that we often referred to. I still refer to, quite frankly.
No, that's great. And I think as well, like it's so important for youth to focus on ESG and DEI issues, because hopefully they're going to be the generation that can make more change and really have the biggest impacts, moving forward.
Yes, I agree.
So in thinking about DEI overall, what do you see as the most important priorities for the commercial real estate industry?
I think that there are probably three key things that are being done, but need to continue to have a micro focus. I think the first thing, and it's a word I've used frequently, it has to be intentional. It isn't, I can hire someone to be in charge of it, I can create a policy or committee. It cannot be passive. It must be active intention to make it successful. And I think many organizations in the business as well as the associations are doing that. And I certainly hope that that focus and impetus will continue in order for it to succeed. I think the second thing that's really important is that those firms that are able to mature this journey continue to share their experience and their resources with those in the industry that may not be so fortunate to be able to do that, and set, the path that those that need to follow or can follow will do so in a way that moves the industry forward in the right direction. And I think the third thing is to continue these conversations in a broader perspective. You're involved in bringing people into the industry from an employment perspective. There are other aspects of our business, and we talked about younger folks and next gen coming into our business, is to make sure that our tenants, our owners, hiring folks, people having conversation with educational organizations, that everyone is aligned or continues to engage so that we make sure that we've got the support and the infrastructure in order to continue to move it forward as it has been.
Well, this has been a really insightful and interesting and certainly thought-provoking conversation. And I know that our listeners are going to really appreciate, you sharing your knowledge and experience. So thank you. Thank you very, very much for joining me today. It's been my pleasure having you.
Thank you. It was a great conversation, and I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you for listening to People Who Perform, the Real Estate Careers podcast brought to you by Highview Partners, a talent search and recruitment firm focused exclusively on Canadian real estate. If your real estate team is looking to find the best next hire, or if you're ready to make the best next move in your career, then reach out to Highview Partners today. Follow us on LinkedIn and visit us at highviewpartners.ca.